Welcome to the Lawless Astrology channel. My name is Dabney, and I have with me today Shannon Cunningham from Sociastrology. Is it Sociastrology? Did I say it
It's sociastrology. Yep.
right? Okay. So she has her own YouTube channel that I watch. I really like her take on, she does these really deep dives on when a planet goes into a new sign. She does monthly forecasts. She also has a membership, and she gives a shout out to all of her members at the end of each video, which I think is so nice. I love that. And she is available for readings as well. So I'm going to put a link to her channel below. It's definitely worth checking out. And today we're going to be talking about Uranus moving into Gemini. So, it's all kind of the soup of everything going on in 2025, but that's kind of our main focus and what people can expect from that, because that's happening next week, July 7th. So, welcome, Shannon.
Thank you so much. It's very nice to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. So I know you did on your channel a deep dive, like, it was, I don't know, like an hour long just on Uranus in Gemini. Do you want to set the stage a little bit about your kind of broad thinking about this transition? I know you had said that it's a big transition going from Uranus and Taurus, where we have been, for since 2018, I think,
Mhm.
moving into, it's kind of a dramatic shift. So what are some of your initial thoughts?
Yeah, it really is. And I love to look at it from like this dichotomy because I will tend to start by looking at the history, and then I will extrapolate by like, okay, what's the historical, cultural, social, political context that we're in right now, and how might these energies be seen to play out in this context? So there's such a huge shift between Uranus and Taurus and Uranus and Gemini historically. And I know that you mentioned on the last Uranus in uh, Gemini video that you did, I think just last week, that there is this common thread, this almost like psychological thread that runs through all of those Uranus and Taurus periods where this was just in the lead up to the US Revolutionary War. This was in the period that was leading up to the US Civil War, as well as the period leading up to the US's involvement in World War II. And one of the common themes that we see throughout those periods of Uranus and Taurus is this strong, I'll put it this way, rightward or very conservative, very almost authoritarian shifts in those periods of time, where yes, those are ideas that are already there as part of the social context, but it gets so extreme. So in the example of the pre-US Revolution, there was such a clampdown on British America by the crown. There were so many taxes thrown on. There was this, of course, utilization of monopoly leading to the Boston Tea Party and everything, where people finally broke. But there was this intense control that was exercised remotely over a population that was seen as subject and even kind of seen as lesser than England itself, where it's this subjectification basically. And then in the antebellum South, boy, that got really intensely mean, where it wasn't just that we were dealing with this grotesque institution of slavery, which we were very well aware was not in alignment with Enlightenment ideals. And we were very aware of that during the previous Uranus and Gemini period of time. That was very clear then. But it became deeply malignant and just really, really hateful. It became a lot more violent, and some of this had to do with, in fact, the revolts that were taking place. I think that was more so during the Uranus in Aries period of time, even before that, where
Mhm.
people started getting afraid that they would lose their grip and started really clamping down. So then we had the lead up to the US involvement in World War II, which was during the 1930s. And of course, we saw how that similar kind of ideology was playing out during that period of time, and how there's this sense of certain people being somehow naturally fit to rule over others. And what fascinates me about this is how ready segments of populations were to pick up on those threads and run with them. And so how these ideas wound up then feeding into the like social and psychological trends, which in a fascinating way, social psychology did really seem to arise out of a deep study of how people were okay with Nazi Germany and what was going on there. And so there's this kind of essentialization of the like belittlement of a segment of the population, which is naturalized and essentialized either through the quote unquote divine right of kings or through the pseudoscientific racism of the mid 19th century, or through these ideas around eugenics in the 1930s. So it's essentialized into the body of people where you're born into a certain position. And it's just always blown me away how during those periods of time, these big parts of society that probably did not behave that way or think that way otherwise would just wind up buying into this because it seemed somehow like maybe they were on the right side of that or on the up of that basically. And so yeah, just how this with Uranus, we're dealing with systems, we're dealing with society, and we're dealing with the mind primarily. And so those those perspectives and how they weave themselves throughout society, I think is hugely significant. And then we always wind up seeing a massive corrective function by Uranus moving into Gemini, where the reaction to the crown, of course, being the US Revolution, which started out in a very like practical kind of a material sense, but then really wound up running with Enlightenment ideals. And of course, we still are utilizing a lot of those ideas now. And then the use of genuine sense of a desire for social progress in the United States and a genuine revulsion against the attitudes of the South among the Union. And that was actually playing out kind of globally as well throughout that period of time. And then the fact that, of course, there were somewhat selfish reasoning behind the initial pushback against Germany because of the expansionary nature of it. But still, it became this ideal. It became this sense of, no, humanity is better than this. We want for social progress. And of course, then even throughout that last Uranus in Gemini period of time, not only was a lot of fascism defeated and the rest of it, of course, kind of consolidated and left to rot, but there was a huge wave of decolonization that wound up coming out of the whole post-war period.
So
yeah.
I think that's, you can tell she does her homework, which I love, and I love that you know about history as well. And the themes too that strike me with Uranus and Taurus is survivalism. It's not
Yes,
survival
yeah,
for everybody, but
yeah,
this was the Great Depression in the US.
exactly. Yeah,
And so, and I do think that, whether it was COVID or pre-COVID, with just the tremendous wealth inequality that came out of, so many decisions, not the least of which was Citizens United, like the things that have just mushroomed during Uranus in Taurus, where people felt desperate. I think
yes,
people started to feel this desperation. And I think that's also that had to do with the rise of fascism in Germany, was the
yes.
desperation, because it was like $20 for a loaf of bread or whatever.
Mhm.
And so when you get to this tipping point, I almost feel like it's a survival tipping point.
It is, yeah.
And so that's the good news, is we've actually been
Yeah,
living through, I think we never talk about, or it's like, oh, every time Uranus goes into Gemini, the US goes to war.
right.
That's true. But what happened before that, right? Like, how did
Exactly.
we get into a war? And this
Mhm.
very uncomfortable feeling of not wanting to go into a war. Like nobody,
Mhm.
wanted that for the longest time. And then like the dam breaks because
Mhm.
things have gotten so messy or things have gotten so desperate. And so financial booms and busts are not uncommon with Uranus and Taurus. And so then all of a sudden Uranus and Gemini, it's like we have to approach this from a fresh manner. We have to see things through new eyes. We have to pick a side. We have to, we
Mhm.
have to decide, the Gemini, the duality, like no longer can I just focus on my survival. I have to pick a side and it has to come through new ideas. So, yeah, let me know what
Yeah,
your thoughts are there.
I am so glad that you mentioned survivalism too, because that was another thing that I was really thinking about specifically this last time, the Great Depression, and how fortunate the U.S. was to have FDR at least speaking to economic issues during that period of time. Because if that hadn't been the case, that the party that won in Germany had a foothold here. And this could have gone a lot differently here if we didn't have FDR over that huge broad period of time, actually trying to address those economic issues. Whether or not he was doing so to the full extent that he could, there was at least a protective function there. And now we're looking at this from the other side in the United States, and there is just such a strong theme around that sense of survivalism and how we can see that in Taurus and how we can see that if that comfort, that security, that stability isn't there for Taurus, it can become kind of reactive, that it will look for that somewhere. And if it can't find it in the material, then it's going to look for any sort of potential leg up that it can get. And that's how we wind up getting into those tribalist kind of attitudes. And I love so much that you mentioned needing to pick sides when Uranus comes into Gemini, because I think that's going to be such a huge theme going forward as well, where it's not that the bifurcation that we've already kind of found ourselves in, for sure, with this extreme polarization, it's not so much that that's going to go away, but there will be a real clarity around,
Mhm.
and I think that that's what has come through with Uranus in Gemini these last few times as well, of the clarity around the more negative aspects of what the ideas are, the perspectives are that are being pushed. We kind of missed that, I think, during the Uranus and Taurus periods of time, because there was some level of deniability. It kind of all just comes out when Uranus moves into Gemini.
I would love to go back. I have not done this, so this is something I will do. Is go back and see prior to the revolution and prior to the Civil War if there were any also natural disasters or events that played into this sense of feeling insecure. Because I know that they had the Dust Bowl, which was a man made
Mhm.
climate change disaster. It was a climate disaster because they weren't honoring the earth, right? Which Uranus and Taurus, it's kind of the earth saying like you will honor how things need to
Mhm.
be done. And we've seen so many climate change disasters like from fires and hurricanes and floods and things that are just devastating people, that I think also adds to this sense of insecurity where you just want somebody strong who says that I'm going to fix it, even though it's very complicated, that it's unwinding some very complicated things that probably need to go back to a more natural way of being. So I would be so interested to see if anything like that during, that contributed to the revolution or the Civil War, like not something we've ever been taught in the books, but like, you know, a famine
Yeah,
or something like that.
yeah, and I wish that I had looked into that too, because I definitely associate Uranus with extreme weather or weather
Yeah.
reactions. And so, yeah, in Taurus, it makes a lot of sense that it would really be impacting the land. One thing that I'm expecting with Uranus and Gemini, I'm maybe a little happy that I won't be in Oklahoma for much of it, but for the sky to really start getting extreme, which is to say that the air, and we're in such a place here that, naturally we get really extreme thunderstorms and of course tornadoes and things like this, which
But there
I'm
was also
definitely
a lot
expecting
of
to be
like
the
when
case.
Uranus went into Gemini the last time, there were a lot of solutions uh,
Hmm. Oh,
there was a
yeah.
solution to the Dust Bowl. There was a
Mhm.
lot of big changes in the way that of agriculture and the way that we kind of remedied some of the
Mhm.
situations that we were dealing with that caused a lot of the problems. So it'll be interesting to see if Uranus and Gemini will also usher in. I'm not saying they're probably going to be back to nature, but like these kind of technological solutions that can maybe help alleviate some of the insecurity that so many of us feel.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be pretty wonderful for a lot of solutions. So another thing that seems to be the case with Uranus in Taurus, it's such an utterly unnatural place for it to be in fixed earth, where it wants to change things up, but it can't seem to get it to move. Um, that I think that there's a lot that is going on under the surface, and this is always something we see in Gemini with Uranus and Gemini as well, is there's this burst of innovation and popularization and running with some solutions that were in the ether or even in a little bit of production, but not quite yet. It wasn't quite ready. Like the moment of so many solutions is coming up during this period of time. And I think that of course, a lot of people are quite concerned or worried about like artificial intelligence and cryptocurrencies with Uranus and Gemini, and that is definitely going to have a major shift and a major boon, the likes of which we're probably not quite expecting in its fullness, and yet. There are solutions even along the lines of the environmental impacts that we have from specifically those two uses of technology that are available. We know that there are certain large language models that take a lot less input, basically. Also, if you're open sourcing AIs, then they don't have to do quite as much work all the time, at least to build them up. There's part of the problem with Bitcoin, for instance, is that it's proof of work. And so every time you do a transaction, it has to go through and verify the entire blockchain, which is insane. But there are proof of stake options that are also available where it's a much lesser um, need for verification. And so it's much less energy intensive. And one of the things that I love about Uranus is that there's some perspectives on like that it takes big things and makes them small and takes small things and makes them big. Of course, we're going to see like nanoization, quantum computing, and like things getting small and big at the same time. But we can have these things and still run them on renewables. We can even have them solve a lot of our problems with renewables in themselves, and offer us some solutions around all of that. Not to mention, a lot of the problems with solutions in society is simply that they're not allowed. We know how to fix a lot of these problems. It's just that it's not profitable to fix a lot of the problems. And so that is one little area that I'm wishfully hoping for sure that we will see play out is that one wonderful way we could utilize AI is yes, there's some baked in rationalization that is very human. It's quite biased based on how we have spoken about things before, but there's so much of seeking expert input on solutions where experts are industry based. And
Mhm.
so it's very hard to get honest viewpoints on how we might organize our society globally for greater fairness, uh, less hegemony, while not allowing for something else to rise up and frighten us about certain powers, maybe having a little bit less of a grip. But then also when it comes to like, okay, let's actually look at how much it would cost to do solar or wind or any sort of other renewable and get a really honest assessment of that and not need to go to experts that are paid by certain industries to say certain things or cook certain numbers or whatever.
Yeah, that's something that's opening my mind up because I don't think I've thought about that gatekeeping piece of it,
Mhm.
which harmonizes nicely with Pluto and Aquarius.
Yeah.
And also All of the Aries. I mean, that's the thing that I just did like a little, 20-minute video today talking about how in 2025 we've got this, everything's new, right? Like all the outer planets flipping over. So there's this whole kind of change. And so it's very jarring and scary, but it all kind of goes back in the fall, except for the Pluto and Aquarius piece. So it's almost like we just are getting like a little hint of it, but we don't have the full picture yet. So even when we get this Uranus and Gemini for the first time, it still has to go back to Taurus. And so, and sometimes in those retrograde final era is when things like really coalesce and you see it for what it is. Like I feel like, personally, the November election was Pluto and Capricorn, like in its last gasps. Like, I was so optimistic and hopeful that it was Pluto and Aquarius coming in, but shame on me. Now I sort of learn like if it's still in that sign, like that's what it is. And, I look at like the new bill that's being produced and stuff and even, people I don't like criticizing it, saying, this is old solutions. This is, you're funding coal, like expense of like wind and solar and like things that are the future. And so I guess the hope that I want to instill in people is that I do think Uranus and Gemini, as fast and as erratic and dynamic as it can be, it's also very forward thinking and hopeful. And so I guess it just kind of go back to like what we were saying from the beginning, which is like people don't really talk about like the lead up to war and like how that in some ways is so much harder because you're holding on. You haven't taken the leap to like stand up for what you believe in and to move forward into the future because the future is unknown. But Uranus and Gemini has no qualms about just leaping into the future. And so there is kind of this fireworks that I would anticipate in 2026 that we're just going to get a preview of now.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of wonderful to see a little bit, get a bit of a view. This is something I've been like talking even to clients about on individual bases because people are so curious about what this alignment looks like, and to just get a sense of how this is going to feel in our charts, and then clear up what we've been dealing with, get another glimpse of all of that, assimilate some of that. I'm sure there's going to be some nostalgic thinking of like, can't we just put the cat back in the bag? Can't we just go back? And my attitude toward this is absolutely not. We can't. The only way to the other side of this is through. We can't go back, And so, yes, with Uranus and Gemini, it is inexorably in a positive social direction. I look at the news and I get worried, and then I look at the astrology and I'm so much more hopeful about the fact that no, these things are genuinely aligning in such a way that we are able to push through some of the unnecessary barriers that have been placed in front of us that haven't quite been bad enough for us to actually do something about it. And that's why we need this chaos agent or whatever you would like to call him, to get us to this point of having something to really rally around, such that we're able to then also hopefully deal with a lot of the issues that we've been sweeping under the rug for some decades too. And
Well,
so
and also you talked about the bifurcation, like the polarization isn't going to go away, but there might be some fluidity of people shifting sides.
yes,
And there might be some people's like that, because Uranus is an awakener. And so there is this sense of like, oh, suddenly it impacted me. Like you're going to see things differently. So before we move on from AI and crypto, I do want to have a little bit of a like discussion with you because I'm not entirely sure where it's going, but especially crypto. But I know that crypto really came into my awareness in 2011 when Neptune went into Pisces. And I know Neptune isn't necessarily associated with money, but it is associated with our dreams and our hopes and, our delusions. And it really seemed like once Uranus moved into Taurus is when like it caught on mainstream. That's when people
Yeah.
actually knew what Bitcoin was. Like I worked in the tech industry, so that's why I've known since 2011. By the way, I could have bought it for like pennies. So
I have a friend who bought someone a coffee and was given a couple Bitcoin for it and wound up holding it the whole time.
so
They
yeah,
were paid back in a few Bitcoin. Yeah.
right. So I mean,
Yeah,
like
that's how it was
literally,
back then.
like back then I didn't know in 2011, I had no idea how to even purchase
Hmm.
it. So
Yeah.
Coinbase didn't exist back then. So it
Hmm.
really was these like very deep tech nerds that were the ones
Yeah,
who
definitely.
knew how to like get this stuff for like
Mm.
20 cents that would go on to be, hundreds of thousands of dollars or anyway,
Mm.
as Neptune and Pisces moved on and Uranus in Taurus moved on, I noticed this frenzy around it that felt very much like the tulip frenzy or,
Right, right.
1929 stock speculation. Like people that don't like people I would not give money to invest for me. Let's put it that way. Like people
Mhm.
who are walking around with these like big gold Bitcoin necklaces and going to conferences and like people that I really have very little respect for, like assuming that they're just going to make billions of dollars. And
Mhm.
that, so there's a little part of me that's like, and then as it's like evolved into meme coins and I'm like, is this thing just going to blow up and not be real? Is it going to be just total vaporware or is it going to evolve? So that's something that I'm playing with also with AI. So much of the language around AI to date by the people creating it has been very dystopian. It has
Yeah.
been very much like, well, this thing's going to just destroy society, but I'm going to keep making it anyway, right?
Mm.
Like the just sort of this acknowledgement that like, oh yeah, and we kind of have to go to Mars because eventually like this is just going to destroy everything, which also seems very Pisces Neptunian to me
Mhm.
as well. So I'm just curious your thoughts there because I know that AI is here to stay. I know it's going to, but is it going to be this game changer in such a dystopian way? The astrology doesn't point to that, in my view.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to me either. Um, it it could, and I'll put a pin in that real quick. And then one thing that I would definitely think supports the Neptune and Pisces with Bitcoin is that when we're questioning whether or not cryptocurrency is going to be real, and I think that that's such a fascinating question, and especially again the fact that that even itself has become kind of a mainstream question as Saturn has joined Neptune, in the mix too, of is this real or not? It's not necessarily, other than the question of state backing, any more or less real than any other form of currency. It's
Right.
just a store of supposed value, and that can fluctuate based on very real or material situations or circumstances or emotion. And, stock markets are very much based on emotion as it is. And I think that we can see that in a very extreme way because of the fact that it's not quite institutionalized when it comes to the cryptocurrencies, and then of course the meme coins and everything like this. I do feel like, and I'm not a financial advisor, but I do feel like there will probably be more of a utilization of it as currency in under Uranus and Gemini, because Gemini has so much to do with currency and exchange, basically the go between, and especially when it comes to the question of a store of information. Value is a form of information. It fits under that umbrella basically, and so I think that there's going to be a lot of developments there, specifically when it comes to its use as currency. Maybe not so much the speculative financialization of it. And so we might not see, weirdly enough, we might not see fluctuations as extreme in the value, but we may see a strong turn toward its actual utilization in exchange, because it is a technology in the sense of Uranus. So we'll expect to see it Gemini-ized, Um,
Yeah. So while you're talking, like you're just sparking some things. So thank you, because like this is a conversation I've wanted to have with someone because
yeah,
I don't have the answers on this. So everybody, we are not financial astrologers.
yeah.
But yeah, if you think about Uranus and Taurus, that was the stock market
Mhm.
came up under that, right? That's
Yeah.
when people started, like everyday people started speculating in the stock market, and there was like a giant crash and people lost all their money. Yet that
Mhm.
didn't mean that the stock market went away. It just meant it was regulated. And then it became something that we all utilize. And then also, like you said, the different currencies during the Civil War.
Yeah.
Actually, maybe we were talking
Yeah.
about it offline. Maybe we should, yeah.
Yeah, we were. I can speak to that quickly here. So one of the things that Gemini definitely speaks to me about is specifically currency because of its ability to be the bridge. Like in my ideal, Gemini is, yes, it's the two sides, but it's also the bridge that crosses there, that brings them together. And that's what currency serves as, is that transfer of value, basically. So it's a pretty like um, perfect, I think, embodiment of Gemini. And so I went back and I was thinking like there was some major movement when it came to currency around the Civil War. And I finally saw, yes, that was when the National Bank Act was passed. And that basically, it didn't make illegal state issuance of currency, but it made it very unprofitable. So it basically instituted a 10% tax on any state issued currency. And then it centralized the issuance of currency federally. And so that was absolutely massive for creating one standardized US dollar and a central kind of control around that. Of course, we didn't have the Federal Reserve quite yet, but then during this last period of Uranus in Gemini, during the 1940s, that was when we had the Bretton Woods Conference. And that was when it was basically agreed the level of the pegging of the US dollar to gold. And then we also saw the pegging of various currencies to the US dollar. And so there is a major revolutionization of currency that we always see under Uranus and Gemini. If we look back before that, we can see then how taxes also come into this too, where big questions around taxation come into it. Of course, during the lead up to the Revolutionary War, and then what the Revolutionary War was kind of sparked by. But then the income tax also nearly positive started due to the Civil War needing to fund that. And so we can see how those things kind of come together too. Yeah.
Sorry, someone started vacuuming.
Oh, you're good.
So, oh my gosh, so interesting. And so I think that that does give people a sense of what's to come. And, so we don't, and that's the thing, trying to predict exactly what will happen under Uranus and Gemini is almost impossible. But
It is because it's Uranus.
right.
Yeah.
But we can see the themes echoed throughout
Mhm.
history, and we can sort of bring in some of the other outer planets to say, like, oh, yeah, so there could be this sort of more decentralization of currency in a way,
Mhm.
or there could be a more world currency, or, but the crisis that precedes it,
Yeah.
that kind of pushes it
That's what feeds
into
into it.
right. And that's a little bit of where we're at now too, because obviously Uranus and Gemini is trade as well.
Hmm. Yeah,
And so we're
exactly.
seeing a lot going on there.
Yes, in trade, and then also I think in shipping lanes is probably also going to become something of an issue, and it's perfect timing for Uranus to be in Gemini with a situation like that coming up, where of course Uranus in Gemini is going to contribute to the destabilization of those trading shipping lanes, but it will also help to innovate around those barriers because it's going to look at those barriers as a Saturnine situation that is not tolerable. And so it will help to find those innovations in logistics to figure out, okay, how can we find alternatives for moving goods? And then that helps us in the future when we're not at conflict with each other and we just have more options then to work with, you know?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
there is a degree of this when you get unstuck, there can be conflict resolution.
Hmm.
And I think that with Uranus and Taurus, we've been a little stuck. So,
Hmm.
are you okay if I move on to the media piece of this, or was there another
Yeah.
piece you wanted to talk about first?
No, I think that's good. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So Shannon used to be an investigative reporter and she did
Mhm.
a lot of good work. And so I'm a lowly Black PR person, but I
Mhm.
always tried to represent good companies that were doing good things. And I loved working with journalists. So we both have been in the journalism world and seen the erosion of it.
Mhm.
And when we were offline, where Shannon was talking about some of the work that she had done in the past, and just feeling like she was doing these really, really good, cool investigative stories and like blowing things open, and it just didn't matter. It didn't make a difference. And sitting with that, because I have Gemini in the South Node, so my brain works, all over the place. And so one of the things
Mhm.
that I just realized is like actually did make a difference for history. There is the posterity of any investigative reporting, even if
Mhm.
the collective can't take it in that moment for the variety of reasons the collective has not been taking in the huge whistleblower stories that have been coming out. um,
Mhm.
we have all been, whether it's Neptune and Pisces, or I mean, I think it's probably Neptune and Pisces has been the destruction of our media, the final leg of it, to be honest with you. Um, so Neptune's going to be moving into Aries, and we see all these
Mhm.
independent upstarts. And, Shannon has a YouTube channel where she talks about history and she talks about astrology. And I have the similar sort of thing. I talk about current
Mhm.
events and I talk about astrology. So we have a voice and we have, probably some similar followings. And,
Mhm.
there's Substacks, and there are people out there that are still saying, like, I'm still going to talk about this stuff as long as I'm allowed to. Like, as long as, like, somebody's not coming to cart me away, you're not
Mhm.
going to,
Yeah.
shut me up. And so, maybe just some of your thoughts there around, did a Uranus play a role? Do you feel like it was primarily Neptune? Like, obviously, Uranus and Gemini is going to play a role in this. So, thoughts?
Yeah, I think a lot of that does make sense as Neptune in Pisces, but there was like one of the main things that I've seen, of course, there is the specific narratives that there's a desire to support those narratives, and that's where the money is. And so you can't really go into, say, mainstream media, which is a large part of what I was working in, and then sometimes I would self-publish. And you can't say certain things. And you all know in the mainstream media, just don't pitch certain stories because they're never going to pick it up anyway. And that could have them look at you a little bit differently, And so I would say yes, it's that, but it's also potentially playing into the broader sign-based minor grand trine that we've actually had in recent years, even with Pluto and Capricorn and Uranus and Taurus. All of that could have wound up playing into it because there was such a desire to control narratives and information to, for one thing, with some of it intentionally divide and conquer. And then in other ways, at the very least, to protect advertisers, you know. Um, and so,
And also their
yeah,
narrative, like you said, the narrative. I'm sorry to interrupt. You finished, but
no,
I have
you're
a
good.
story to tell. I mean,
That's such a huge part of it. And then there's another aspect of it where there's almost this kind of a I'm going to use a word that's not a word, but almost this like dopaminization of the news media as well, where it's not about learning. It's not about finding out what's going on. It's not so much about like just sharing what's actually happening and then relying on society to respond to it accordingly. It's more along the lines of reinforcing and affirming certain specific ideas about in groups and out groups, and then feeling better about oneself because one is able to say, no, I'm the good guy in this. I knew that they were bad, because certain outlets only cover certain stories about certain types of people. They don't do, the whole spread. If you, of course, tune into certain channels in the United States, you will only hear absolute horror stories about immigration in a migrant nation. We should all identify with this. This is our parents, and yet somehow, just because there's only specific stories that are told to certain audiences, there's this reinforcement of their already existing beliefs. And that is not so much informative, it's more so entertaining. People have been so exhausted that there's been almost this kind of shutting down of being able to handle any more of a cognitive load than necessary. And so if one has some strongly held beliefs and they seek out information about that thing, that they care about a lot, and they wind up in these ecosystems, which of course Uranus and Taurus, that are reinforcing that, but then adding in little extra things, little extra, dividing types of tactics and things like this, where you do get these very different realities, and so I think that it's a little bit of both, plus possibly some of the very like corporate control supporting Pluto in Capricorn too,
Yeah, because
So,
they're,
yeah.
yeah, the corporatization of the news media got rid
Mhm.
of so many amazing journalists.
Mhm.
And now it's interesting to watch AI take over newsrooms too, which is happening, which is interesting
Yeah.
to see that that's where this is going. But then the flip side of that is that Neptune in Aries, where I see so many upstarts and people
Yep.
getting their information. I mean, I think there's going to continue that sort of individual bias in a way.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, but the days seem to be gone where we all got our news from the same source, but maybe there will be some kind of solution or coming back to new normal.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, media is absolutely going to be revolutionized by Uranus and in Gemini. We saw huge uh, moves forward with media in the last two times at the very least. Of course, we had the proliferation of newspapers in the 1860s, and then we had the advent of television in the 1940s, and the uh, vast proliferation of radio. And so I think that it's likely that, especially with Neptune and Aries, like you mentioned, which actually that was a repeat of the Civil War. We also had Neptune and Aries then. But I do think that there's going to be a major focus on independence, perhaps especially in the media, because what kind of information we're getting and how that's supporting us, or how that is making us very anxious potentially as well with Uranus and Gemini, I think is going to become a lot more clear, and it will be a bit more individualized. Now, is that going to feed into like greater siloing of different groups of people? Probably on some level, but one of the interesting things with Uranus, it does always bring up unintended consequences, and we tend to look at that as a negative thing. But we also then see some really wonderful unintended consequences as well that wind up coming out of these things. And I think that even reinforcing that desire for people to receive information from sources that are at the very least less beholden
Mhm.
to interests. If you want to be biased as all get out, okay, but at least if you're representing yourself and your own ideas, and then also, with a lot of the people who are on YouTube who are trying to share like what's going on in the world and everything, there's a two-way conversation as well with YouTubers that isn't quite the case with the traditional news media. And of course, we see their ratings are tanking. But in addition then to all of that, there's also, I think, going to be a major revolt against the walled garden type of World Wide Web that we've been engaging with for a while. I think that with Uranus dealing so strongly with both networks and a form of like liberation from constraints, and then with Gemini so perfectly representing the connections between people, which is to say networks, that there's there's not only going to be a desire to break out of Web 2.0, which is so centralized even among certain social media platforms, like this one and many others. Um, there's going to be a desire to break out of the controls of that. But then there can also be the creation of alternative networks fully. And so that's a weird little niche world that I've been in for a while with journalism and digital privacy and stuff like this. Those are the kinds of communities where there's already an idea, it's already kind of a thing, but there's no way to popularize it, that tends to get thrust into the spotlight or thrust into popularity under Uranus and Gemini, which has a major popularizing kind of effect to it. And so there are not only networks that can sit on top of the internet that a lot of people use for different reasons, especially if there's any sort of major censorship in certain nations as we sort out the conflicts that we're going to be dealing with in the coming years. If there's a crackdown, there are solutions around that. And there's already a community that isn't really well known that is really centered around like digital privacy, and they are very supportive of the sharing of ideas broadly. So, for instance, with alternative media, there's a lot of alternative media platforms that already exist too. It's just that they don't have that network effect yet. And I would not be surprised to see some of those more independent platforms, especially federated platforms and things like this, to start really taking off in the coming years to share information in a way that's not centrally controlled too. But for instance, like if there are crackdowns, there's the Tor network is obviously a little bit controversial due to some of the reasons that it's been used, but it's also used by dissidents in certain nations because they're not able to access certain information. And so I think that's also going to be an important part of this is it's likely with Uranus and Gemini that there will be a wonderful media disruption, but there could also be the other edge of that sword, kind of a media disruption where certain ideas are blocked from view too. And so I think finding ways around that, finding ways to connect. There's even in some countries currently that are really locked down these sneaker nets where people will write things up. They'll maybe write articles or they'll have a little zine or whatever that's on USBs, a series of USBs, and you send it out. And people have computers; they just don't have the internet. So they're able to then communicate with each other that way in ways that can't be seen at all from the outside.
Yeah.
And mesh networks and things like this. There's all sorts of ways to connect independently that I think it's going to really be a boon to places like YouTube. But I think it's also going to proliferate so many alternatives even to what we already have.
And it's a long transit. Uranus is going to
Yeah,
be in Gemini until 2033. And so what may start as crisis becomes
right.
solutions, right? There was still, like the Social Security Administration wasn't created until there was a need that
Hmm.
wasn't being met. Like there's going to be needs that are going to be unfortunately coming up, so there may be that more. We're already starting to see it, right? We're already starting to see more censorship, like people, shaking down major networks for money
Hmm.
and you know just kind of like, well, I mean, I have a friend who does opposition research, no longer lives in this
Hmm.
country, um, and was feeding the papers stories, and within, like, there was a blackout within 3 months before the election because they kind of figured out who was going to win, and so
Hmm.
they wouldn't publish any of the stories. that they traditionally would because they were fearful of retribution.
Mhm.
So, we're
Yeah,
already
that
kind of getting that.
yeah, that self-censorship I think is going to be pretty significant, sadly, of a factor. And that's one of the ways also that those networks can help. Because while I on this level, I do at least know about the stuff a little bit more. I would never really fully recommend putting anything on a computer that you don't want to be seen. But it can give a little bit of an extra layer of comfort in speaking one's mind without as much fear that they're just doing so out in the open, and that's part of how these networks are used in other countries already. And I think sadly that it's going to become a little bit more relevant here in the United States in the years to come, and possibly even in other countries, because it's not like the US just has reach here too.
Right. And so I think Uranus and Gemini, there could be an increase in surveillance and things like that. But
Hmm.
there also, I guess, like I do want people to have faith that
Yeah,
there are solutions. It's a very creative, dynamic transit where it's like, okay, I'm going to throw this at you. Well, then I'm going to zigzag over here. Like there is
exactly.
kind of that energy of like, it's a very rebellious time that we're going to be living in when you take it as a whole.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the thing about it is it's so wonderful also looking back, because there are so many things that we couldn't necessarily imagine, innovations that we don't right now need, that we'll have, and that will be then wonderful to run with going forward. A lot of people, there's this whole like a dead internet theory right now, where a lot of people are very frustrated even just with the state of the internet right now. But as there are innovations and as there are interesting little pushes and pulls, especially with the Saturn Neptune conjunction in Aries, speaks so strongly to me of like this kind of gritty, real like zine culture,
Mm.
and how this can be created on like alternative social media networks and things like that, and how they create their own little cultures, and how the desire to create that culture and to speak in that way today can push us to create these kind of technological innovations for now, that when we're no longer doing so out of a state of necessity or a sense of necessity, then looking back, we can be like, well, that honestly, a lot of it might have been worth it for the innovations and for the social progress that wound up coming out of that in the end. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, was there anything else you wanted to touch on? I know we touched on a lot of big, broad topics. Um, did you want to talk about the trine or the sextile at all, or?
I think, yeah, we should tie that in a bit at least, in terms of, again, I kind of want to reinforce some of what you were getting at around how Pluto in Aquarius and Uranus in Gemini, they'll both, they will both be double-edged. And when we see the more upsetting aspects of that playing out, and specifically that's going to be around control around technology and things like that,
Yeah.
there's such a wonderful other side to that. And what I'm trying to get at is like, we can only see that if we're innovating against the control.
Hmm.
And the apex of this minor grand trine being Neptune, this like cultural kind of etheric planet that's, the basically the collective unconscious, what it is that we're picking up on. And that being so focused on one's own sovereignty and one's own independence and one's own individuality. And then hopefully also recognizing the need with the networked signs of Aquarius and Gemini also playing into this and supporting diversity, which is also really supported by both of those signs. Hopefully, holding space for each other to all be different, to not necessarily like it's interesting how, yes, with Uranus and Gemini, we'll probably need to pick sides. But I think through that process, what we're going to wind up realizing is the subjectivity of experience, generally speaking, for all of us. And the fact that we do really, if we want to feel that we have a sense of freedom for ourselves, we do need to hold that space for everyone. And so we can't keep putting each other in boxes. We do
Mhm.
need to see where we can bridge together. We do need to see how we can work together, how we can hold space for each other, and then just create a sense of freedom and connection and community in our own lives for ourselves, and then hold space for others to also create that for themselves too, you know.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay. I love that. I hope that that gives people watching some excitement around
I hope
this
so
new
too.
planetary energy coming our way. Um, I personally, as someone with a lot of water and earth, all this fire and air, I think it's a very exciting time. It's a very, very creative time. I think it's a time that's just going to awaken all of our souls to our true purpose. And
It's really going to awaken a lot of people from the slumber of the past 7 years of the water and earth. Yeah,
And I think maybe people have needed to get some purpose back. Like, I think,
absolutely.
you hear these stories and it's like, okay, well, now, that here is what this is all about. What
Mm.
has this been all about? Well, now we're about to find out, I think. And
Yeah.
and I hope that we don't all just become zombies and let AI take over and we're all like homeless and like I just don't see that
Yeah, I
happening,
don't think so.
It's like at the end of the day, it would take a lot of people inertia, a lot of people just being like, oh, I don't care about my life.
I
And
think that may even wind up being one of the unintended consequences of AI is the human factor of the humane sign of Gemini as well. Speaking to the brilliance of the human mind, it's very likely that through over reliance initially on artificial intelligence, which we're already kind of seeing, that companies are needing to pull back because they expected it to be able to do stuff that it simply can't, and that we're not going to be able to innovate our ways into having it do, which is critical thinking. It's only based on what it's been taught from the solutions that humanity has already created. But there's so many other solutions and so many other ways of doing things that we can think of that the AI simply can't. And so I think that that's also going to be some of that, that Promethean gift of Uranus bringing to us the recognition of our own intelligence, and the fact that we can't be copied.
beautiful. Oh my gosh. Do you see why I like talking to
Oh,
Shannon and why you should go subscribe to her channel? And if you want to get a reading, she's still booking.
mhm.
So, and join her community, any of those things. Like I said, I'm going to put that information below. And then, as always, please do subscribe and like this if you like this conversation. And I have to do my own plug because I always forget to do it. But for the month of July, I have my beginner astrology class and I am doing it for half off. It isn't, there will be no live sessions, it's all the recordings. But it is such a good deal. And this is the lowest it's going to be. It's $39. And I got such good feedback from all the people that took it. So if you've ever wanted to learn just the basics of how to understand where Uranus is in your own chart, because that's something that we haven't talked about,
Mhm.
which is, and I think Shannon does have a video about that. You can look and see what house Uranus is in for you, and that'll give you clues on a more personal level how it's going to impact your life and where there's kind of revolutions taking place in your own life. So that is something that I encourage you to check out, and I'll have a link about that below. And then I'm also speaking at the Radiant Astrology Zeitgeist Summit, and I will put a link for that, and it's a free summit. So, um, Shannon, it
Awesome.
has been a pleasure. So thank you so
Yeah.
much. I hope
Thank
you
you
come
too
back.
so much. Yeah, absolutely. This was super, super fun. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, everyone out there, there's a reason and a season for it all, and the universe is
Yeah.
conspiring to help us. So don't forget that. Have a good
Mhm.
one.
Absolutely.